Good evening and welcome to a very special edition of Tysky Sour. We have a first this evening, which is we are going to be showing you a live stream direct from Downing Street. We'll give you a bit of commentary as it goes along, but mainly we'll come in once it's finished for all the analysis you need. It is going to be a very significant conference. We're going to see Boris Johnson next to Rishi Sunak and Chris Whitty. As far as I can remember, this is the first time in a long time we've seen Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak together in a conference. They're going to be delivering both the health and the economic response to the current spike. You can see them coming out there now. I'll be in the studio with Aaron in a few moments.
Good evening,
Let's go
everyone.
to the Downing
Thank
Street
you for
press conference.
Joining us. I'm glad that we have the Chancellor Rishi Sunak with us and our Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty. We're entering a new and crucial phase in a fight against coronavirus because the number of cases has gone up 4 times in 4 weeks and it's once again spreading among the elderly and vulnerable. There are already more COVID patients in UK hospitals today than there were on the 23rd of March when the whole country went into lockdown, and deaths, alas, are also rising once again. These figures are flashing at us like dashboard warnings in a passenger jet, and we must act now. So we're giving local authorities across England around £1 billion so they can protect vital services as they fight the virus. Nightingale hospitals across the north of England are being prepared for service. And so we can squash this virus wherever it appears, we are today simplifying, standardising, and in some places toughening local rules in England by introducing 3 levels of COVID alert. Medium, with existing national measures such as the rule of 6 and the closure of hospitality at 10 p.m. High, with extra measures including a ban on indoor social mixing between households or support bubbles. And very high for places where without further action the NHS will swiftly be under intolerable pressure. Areas within the very high alert category will be reviewed every 4 weeks and nowhere will be shut down indefinitely. And the exact restrictions at this level, very high, will be worked out with local leaders along with tailored packages of support. But at a minimum, they will sadly include a ban on all social mixing between households in private places, including gardens, and pubs and bars must close unless they can operate solely as a restaurant serving alcohol only as part of a main meal. We will also ask people not to travel into and out of very high alert level areas. No one affected by this will be left to fend for themselves, and we're going to expand our unprecedented economic support to assist those affected by these decisions, extending our job support scheme to cover 2/3 of the wages of those in any business that is required to close, and providing those businesses with a cash grant of up to £3,000 a month instead of £1,500 every 3 weeks, and extra funding too for those in the very high category for local test and trace and enforcement. You will shortly be able to type in your postcode to gov.uk and see exactly what restrictions apply where you live. The majority of the country will, for now, be at medium. Most areas currently under local intervention will be at high, and Nottinghamshire, including Nottingham itself, East and West Cheshire, and a small area of High Peak, will also move to this level. Over the weekend, we've been working with local leaders in areas where the data are most worrying, and from Wednesday, local authorities in the Liverpool City region will move to the very high alert level. In addition to pubs and bars, we've agreed with Liverpool City Mayor Steve Rotherham that gyms, leisure centres, betting shops, adult gaming centres and casinos will close. We're still working with other local leaders to determine how best to tackle the resurgence of the virus in their areas, but tackle it we will. No one wants to impose these kinds of, least of all me, wants to impose these kinds of restrictions, erosions of our personal liberty. But I'm as convinced as I've ever been that the British people have the resolve to beat this virus, and that together we will do just that. With that, I'm going to hand over to the Chancellor, who's some more details on how we'll be supporting these businesses, employees, and areas affected by today's changes. Rishi, over to you.
Thanks, PM. Good evening. The Prime Minister has set out the next stage in our health response to tackling coronavirus. And I know people are frustrated at the prospect of further restrictions, but I want to reassure you that we have a comprehensive plan to protect jobs and businesses in every region and nation of the United Kingdom. Our winter economy plan has three parts. First, the job support scheme will protect jobs, whether your business is open or closed. If your business can open safely, but with reduced or uncertain demand, the government will directly subsidise people's wages over the winter, giving businesses the option to bring people back to work on shorter hours rather than making them redundant. That's the right approach for businesses who can remain open. But businesses who are being asked to close will need further support. So on Friday, I announced that we're expanding the job support scheme. If the closures mean you are unable to work for 1 week or more, your employer will still be able to pay you 2/3 of your normal salary, and the UK government will cover the cost. This national programme will benefit people the same wherever they live and whatever job they do. The existing furlough scheme continues throughout October, with the new job support scheme available from November, so there is no gap in support. And to give people and businesses certainty, the scheme will run for 6 months through to next spring. The job support scheme is in line with most other major European countries. And to support the lowest paid through this crisis, we have also made our welfare system more generous and more responsive too. Second, businesses in England who are legally required to close can now claim a cash grant of up to £3,000 per month, depending on the value of their business premises. Those grants can be used for any business costs and will never need to be repaid. And I'm guaranteeing an extra £1.3 billion of funding to the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland administrations if they choose to do something similar. Third, the Prime Minister has announced today we are providing additional funding for local authorities. For local authorities entering Level 3, we're providing up to £500 million to fund activities like enforcement, compliance and contact tracing. And to protect vital services, we're providing around £1 billion of additional funding for all local authorities on top of the £3.7 billion we've already provided since March. Our winter economy plan will give people and businesses flexibility and certainty over the coming months, whether they are open or required to close. All part of our plan to protect the jobs and livelihoods of the British people. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rishi. Chris.
Thanks, Ben. Could I have the first slide, please? The slides that follow tell a story that is relatively clear to understand. This is the first slide is from the Office for National Statistics, ONS, Household Infection Survey, and it's, in our view, the most robust study of the virus. And what it shows is the prevalence, how many people had it in the population from the end of April through to the beginning of October. And as you can see on this graph, the numbers of people with it went down really steadily through till the beginning of June, thanks to the remarkable efforts of the entire nation, and then continued down at a low level until the beginning of September, at which point they began to rise again. And you can see on this graph that they're now really up to a level that was there at the beginning of May. Next slide, please.
All of those slides on it, but we've got plenty of that empirical information for you a little bit later in the show, because there was actually Jonathan Van Tam, who was a Deputy Chief Medical Officer, who did a press conference earlier in the day. Lots of worrying statistics, which we will have for you after this conference finishes. But first of all, I want to go to you, Aaron, for also some comment on what Rishi Sunak has announced there. He's saying he's going to give certainty to people and businesses. He still hasn't explained. I hope he'll have some questions asked to him about this in the question and answer section, why it's 2/3 instead of 80% for people who are furloughed because they're in a lockdown region. There's still been no explanation whatsoever for why people should have to live on less in November than people had to live on in March. Doesn't make sense whatsoever. Also, there is no certainty for people who are self-employed. That was something that you mentioned there. So if you're in an area which has gone to tier 3, for example, you're a taxi driver, you can't make much income at all if you're self-employed. And I've just looked it up. You only get 20% of your profits in the third round of the self-employed support scheme. So initially it was 80% of your profits, then 70%, and they've suddenly taken it all the way down to 20%, and we haven't seen any further support offered there.
Yeah, I think, well, tradespeople, it's not just, taxi drivers is a big example for me, because obviously we're about to see the night economy get hammered. So you might be somewhere where it's in tier 2, and so there's still some economic activity. If you're a taxi driver there or working in the night economy, that's not too bad, it's not the end of the world. Tier 3, those bars, restaurants, clubs are getting a lot of economic support that you're not getting as a taxi driver. Similarly, if you're a tradesperson, if you're going in and if you're a plasterer or a decorator or a bricklayer, and you just work, like I said, on a freelance basis, you're not necessarily working for a company, you're not on PAYE, there seems to be a major gap there. And I suppose the logic is, and this is very early days, maybe there's more proposals down the line. That's what happened earlier this year. But ultimately, the self-employed, freelancers and so on don't tend to vote Tory.
Should we go back to the screen, see if he's finished on his slides or what he's talking about now?
But I think we should be not lulled into a false sense of security here in the southwest.
Live thing. Nice work, Novara.
And the southeast. Next slide, please. And I think something which has got a lot of traction over the last few days in the press is the fact that there are very variable rates by different age groups. And in blue, light blue, we have those 10 to 19. In reality, this is mainly people over the age of 16, and in green, those 20 to 29. And what we have in these areas is the first rapid rise is in younger people, but then you start to see rises across the entire age group, and illustrated this in the northeast, the northwest, and Yorkshire and Humber. But the same pattern is being seen at a much lower rate elsewhere in the country. Next slide, please. Now, I think there was a hope that this would not translate into hospital admissions.
Yeah, so actually, I think he's actually using exactly the same slides that Jonathan Van Tam used earlier, so we might be able to get some of those up. But I mean, basically, they're putting forward a picture which is no secret. We all know what's been going on, which is that coronavirus cases have been increasing rapidly in certain parts of the country, mainly in the north of England. As we're going to talk about, that's partly, and in fact, I mean, you could argue mainly because that when the government sort of adopted all of these loosening policies, so in August we obviously had Eat Out to help out, that may have been appropriate for London, who had sort of passed by a long way the peak of the epidemic, and the virus was largely suppressed, whereas in the northwest, for example, Andy Burnham had been consistently very noisy about the fact that this seemed like a policy designed for London. Cases of coronavirus in Manchester were still fairly high, yet people were getting subsidised meals out. It didn't really make sense, and we're seeing the result of that now. So it was sort of a mistake of government policy back in August, which was London-centric, which now means that sort of these harsher restrictions are being imposed on the northwest and the northeast, which is why we are going to see so many tensions. And we already have seen so many tensions brewing this weekend between, for example, Andy Burnham and the central government, and it's a sort of local central tension which we will continue to see. He stopped looking at the side, so I reckon... Oh, no, he's still looking at the side. Aaron, I'm going to go to you in general. I mean, I imagine most of our audience will know about the three-tiered system by now. So what Boris Johnson announced in Parliament today is something that's been briefed for days now. Since the beginning of the month, we were talking about a three-tiered coronavirus system, which is going to have a top tier or actually it's going to be a bottom tier, which is moderate risk, which is most people, then a tier 2, which is high risk, which is going to be the people who are currently in local lockdowns. The condition there is going to be no household mixing inside. And in tier 3, which is the highest tier, it's only going to apply to Liverpool. You're going to have pubs and bars closed. We're going to go back to the stream now because it's going back to Boris Johnson.
What support is there for industries like the event sector who, due to government restrictions, have been shut down since March?
Well, I should say that all businesses that have been forced to close get the JS, the job support system that Rishi has announced. But Rishi, why don't you say a bit more about what businesses like the event sector? I mean, you're right, Helen. It's a massive business. I think it's worth about 90 billion to our country. But there's plenty that we're doing to support it.
Yeah, thanks, PM, and thanks, Helen. You're absolutely right. We've put support in place since March for across hospitality, leisure and retail through our business rates reduction programme, so people with physical properties are not paying any business rates. Many businesses would have received cash grants of £10,000 or £25,000 at that time. But you're right, there are some sectors which are now not able to trade in the way that they normally would. And for those, what we've put in place is the job support scheme, which allows companies who are open but not trading to benefit from wage support from the government. So they can bring employees back, but not at the same level that they previously had because the demand is not quite there, the activity is not quite there, and that wage subsidy will help. And that's something we announced a few weeks ago. I think more broadly, there are specific businesses that are being told to close by government, not just now, going forward in this localised way, that have been told to close for a while. Now, if you're in that category, nightclubs being another one, for example, you will be able to benefit from the expansion of the JSS. If you've been told to close in the past and that continues, you will also be eligible for that extra support and those extra business grants. But I'm very sympathetic to your situation and those of other businesses like yours, and we're all keen to try and find a way where we can to get our economy going and get your businesses back to life as well. That's the best way in the long term to try and protect the jobs that your sector has.
Brilliant, thanks, Rishi. Let's go to Charlotte from Chesterfield. Charlotte asks, after months apart from our extended families, many people are clinging to hope of having some kind of family Christmas, though understandably not a normal one. What kind of restrictions do you expect over the festive period? Charlotte asks. Well, all I can say, Charlotte, and to millions who are wondering the same question, is that we'll do our absolute best to try to make sure that we get life back to as close to normal as possible for Christmas. But that is going to depend, I'm afraid, on our success in getting this virus down and our ability as a country to follow through on the package of measures. And I've said it before and I've said it again, but it will mean that in those local areas that we've talked about, we're not only going to have to intensify the measures, but we're going to have to enforce generally the social distancing, the rules, the guidance, hands, face, space, get a test if you have symptoms, self-isolate if you're contacted by NHS test and trace. All that basic stuff is essential if we're going to come out of this and allow people to have anything like a normal Christmas. But Chris, is there anything you want to add on that? Thanks very much, Charlotte. Let's go to the media, and first to Laura from the BBC.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. A question for each of you tonight. Prime Minister, you've said many times you want to avoid another national lockdown, but it seems every week you introduce extra rules and cases still rise. Are you just delaying the inevitable? And Chancellor, you encouraged people to go out and spend money when cases were much higher still in the north of England than in the south. How do you now expect workers in pubs and bars in the north of England that have to close to live on 2/3 of their wages when they can't pay 2/3 of their bills? And Professor Whitty, are you confident what's being announced now is really enough to slow the spread of the disease? Can I just lastly ask one of you to explain what people who are really vulnerable, who may have been shielding, should do now, because we haven't heard very much about them today.
4 good questions from Laura.
Okay, well, first of all, Laura, I really hope that we won't have to go back into anything like a national lockdown of the kind that we did in March and April. And I really hope that with the package of measures that we've got, if properly implemented and enforced, we can get the R down. And I just go back to what Chris was saying. These measures do work. I mean, don't forget the R was coming down in this country before we went into full lockdown in March, because people had already started to follow guidance about restricting contact and restricting transmission in the way that they needed to do. Lockdown was also essential to drive that home. But this package depends on public support. I think what's encouraging today is we've got people like Steve Rotherham in the Liverpool City region stepping up with strong local leadership. I think if we can get that over the next few days across the country in the areas where we've got high incidence, that will make a huge difference. But be in no doubt, this is a balanced package. We could go for a national lockdown again. I think many people would think that was extreme, and it would do a great deal of extra harm to our economy, to our ability to. We'd have to take kids out of school. It would do a lot of immediate harm. We don't want to go down that extreme route right now. Similarly, there are the people on the other side of the argument who say, "Oh well, let's just learn to live with this. Let's stop trying to fight this virus. Let's stop trying any kind of measures at all to contain it." I can't support that approach, I'm afraid, Laura, because it would all the maths is brutal. It would lead to too many fatalities. So we have to do a balanced approach, the moderate approach that we're taking, and relying on the public, on the cooperation of local government and government at all levels to make it work.
Michael,
yes.
Are you not kind of shocked?
Laura,
at the
you're
fact
absolutely
that
right.
Nobody's asking, was this avoidable? It's all about the measures and will they be effective, and nobody's actually saying, look, we're about to go into this massive shift again. Did it have to be like this?
I want to see Rishi Sunak with the 2/3.
As we go through this
He's
difficult
asking,
winter
can people have
period.
2/3?
With regard to the exact level of support, I'd make 2 points, if I may. The first is that at 2/3, we're very much in line with large other European economies who provide similar wage support schemes. France, for example, is 60% or 70%, depending on the sector. Germany's scheme starts at 60% and goes up from there. Spain at 70% and drops down to 50%. I could go on, but you'll get the broad picture is we're very much in line with peers. But obviously that might not be comforting to you if you're the person on the other end of that and you still need to try and make ends meet. What I'd say is we've invested several £billion in improving the generosity of our welfare system this year, primarily through the increase in universal credit and also local housing allowance. And what that means is not only is that system more generous, it's also responsive to people's needs. So as people who are the lowest paid that you talked about see that their earnings are going down, the way universal credit works is that the welfare payments will go up to compensate for a good chunk of that. And if you look at someone, say in their, pick an example, someone in their late 20s, privately renting, working 35 hours at the minimum wage, let's just say, living in a city like Manchester, for example, what they would see on an after tax and after benefits change in their income would mean that they're probably just over 90% of their previous income once all those changes had worked through. So our system is designed particularly to help those who are lowest paid, to help them get through what we hope is a temporary but no doubt difficult period.
On the two you asked me, I am very confident that the measures that are currently in place
this thing about,
are helping to...
if you're on 35 hours a week, you're on minimum wage, it's not so bad. What if you're on minimum wage and you're on 15 hours a week or 17 hours a week? Because the Tories for years have really tried to, we always talk about how precarious the labour market is. People might be working 2 part-time jobs. You may have really lost one during this. You might be a young mum who's also caring for a kid. What do they do? And again, this seems to me there's 2 big people from what we've seen so far who seem to have fallen through the gaps. Self-employed and people on low wages who aren't working a full-time week.
I mean, the other issue is it's just a bit. I think people see it as disrespectful. The amount of money it's saving the government is minimal. Why not just keep it at 80%? Anyway, we've always silenced Chris Whitty. Let's take another look at Chris Whitty. He doesn't have slides now. We've got no excuse to silence the guy.
These only work if people buy into them. I don't just mean the political leaders, although absolutely essential that they do and that there is as much consensus as possible, but also everybody has got to buy into them. Because that's how it works, is everybody doing their bit within this, and therefore that is important, that we have local as well as national agreement. This is what we need to do. In terms
Everyone
of
do your bit.
your
Dominic Cummings is going to be there.
On shielding,
You can't stand next to Boris Johnson and say the important thing is everyone knows they have to do their bit. It's the massive elephant in the room.
The short version is
We'll go back.
people who were previously in the shielding group are at greater risk, and we would advise them always to take greater precautions. But we also recognise that there was significant difficulties and often mental distress and loneliness for people who were put into shielding as they certainly perceived it. And I think we're trying to deal with that in the way that we approach shielding over the next phase. But it is something where we do want people to take extra precautions where they can.
Thanks very much, Laura. Let's go to Robert Peston of ITV.
Prime Minister, are you saying that if it were not for the opposition of some mayors and local government leaders, other areas, especially in the north, would already be in the very high category? And Professor Whitty, the Prime Minister, said today that there are now more people in hospital than when the country was locked down on March the 23rd. People are scared and confused. We know that lockdown suppressed the virus. How can we be confident that these much lesser measures will do the same job of protecting us?
Well, first, Robert, it's absolutely correct to say that we're working with local authorities across the country, but particularly with those badly affected regions that everybody knows about in the northwest, in the northeast, Yorkshire, Humber, and so on, trying to work with them to support a collective package of measures. I was very pleased that Steve Rotherham of the Liverpool City region, came forward with a package. We're helping him, and the offer is that to all local leaders who are facing problems, big increases in infection rates, will help to support more local test and trace, more local enforcement, and so on. Where we stand
12 billion on
ready
Serco.
To work with local government at all levels. But
I mean, this also feeds into the whole doing your bit thing, which Chris Whitty, he's a health professional, he shouldn't be talking in those terms, doing your bit. How come Vietnam's only had one COVID death since early September? It's not because they're all doing their bit more than we're doing our bit in Britain, it's because they've got an effective test and trace programme.
Over the next few days and weeks.
My experience as a doctor has been absolutely that people in Britain actually do not tend to get scared. What they want is people to give them very straight news and know the worst, and then discuss what we should do. And
People
then
in Britain don't get scared.
How to do it. Now, in terms of lockdown, as people put it, I mean, lockdown is now means a whole bunch of different things in different areas, and we're not talking about the kinds of lockdown there were at the end of March and the beginning of April. But it is the case we are going to have to do more. That's the whole point of what the Prime Minister has just announced, and probably in some areas significantly more. And the balancing act here, and in a sense that's reflected by the fact the Chancellor and I are standing here, is doing things which do the things which pull down the virus to the point where the R goes below 1, but with a minimal impact on the economy that you can get away with that. But none of us have any illusions about this, and I would like to be really clear about this, because I think we should not have any illusions. The idea we can do this without causing harm is an illusion. And every country in the world is struggling with this. And I'm confident we will get through it, but it is a balancing act between two harms: a harm for society and the economy on the one hand, and a harm for health on the other hand. And if we damage the economy, we damage long-term health, and if we damage health, we damage the economy and the confidence in the economy. So getting these right is critical, and we're all trying
This
to
is
find
complete nonsense. The
balance
idea that,
along the way, really
what's in the best interest of the economy and what are in the best interest of public health are at odds with one another is just categorically, it's not true. You know, when we had the lowest number of new cases, lowest number of deaths, it was in the summer. It's when we saw an expansion of economic activity. It's ridiculous.
Warnings in a passenger jet, and we must act now. And yet the only part of the country today put under these much stricter rules is the Liverpool City region. Why is your rhetoric on this outstripping the reality of the measures you're actually introducing? And is it because you're struggling to take regional leaders with you? And Chris Whitty, some areas like Bradford, where I am now, have been living under restrictions throughout the summer and into the autumn. An analysis from the Labour Party last week showed 19 out of 20 of those areas put into local lockdowns have still not come out of them. What is going on? Were they the wrong restrictions, or are people not following the rules?
Well, first of all, Beth, I mean, just really to repeat what I was said to Robert, we want to take local authorities with us. That obviously, a local approach can be immensely valuable in enforcement. There's local knowledge of the area, the places, where the virus may be transmitted. Local activity in closing down people who are transparently breaking the rules. Local
it's got nothing to do with people
enforcement,
breaking
local
the rules.
test and trace. These can be fantastically powerful, and we want to work with local authorities to deliver this, and that's why we're offering the deals and the solutions that we are. But just to repeat the point I made just now, if we can't get agreement, then clearly it is the duty of national government to take the necessary action to protect the public and to protect public health, and we will.
And on Bradford specifically, I mean, Bradford actually has shown superb leadership. The local authority has, the directors of public health have, the local NHS have, in the way that they have tackled this. If they had not done so and consistently working with the communities of Bradford, we would be in a substantially worse place than we are.
Somebody in the comments
moment.
just said it was waffle. Boris Johnson's answer to Beth Rippey's quite good questions, actually. I mean, I think that's a pretty good description of most of what he says, but particularly that.
Well, also, I mean, if they're honest, no one's going to come out of lockdown. Once you're in, you're not going to come out, because the whole issue is you can't safely open a pub in the winter because you can't have a properly ventilated space. There is no COVID-secure pub in midwinter, so it's just about how long people can carry on, before the virus gets that severe. Unless you have such a severe lockdown that you basically, almost eradicate the virus, which is not being proposed, you're going to stay in that until spring or until we get a vaccine.
Because we're not Vietnam.
Because the great majority of people want this to protect their neighbours, to protect their family, and to improve the situation over once we get through the winter, which is going to be difficult, and everybody knows that.
Thanks very, very much, Beth. Let's go to Gordon Rayner of the Daily Telegraph.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You pointed out earlier today that there still isn't a vaccine for SARS. If there isn't a COVID vaccine this winter, will your default position be to ask people to adhere to the current restrictions for the coming year or so? And just also, Andy Street, the West Midlands Mayor, has pointed out that his area is in Tier 2, even though it only has a quarter the level of infection that Manchester does, which is in the same tier. Do you acknowledge that there are huge inconsistencies in the decisions over which area goes into which tier?
Well, Gordon, first of all, on the sort of variations in the tiers and people's feelings of that there are anomalies, that's inevitably going to happen in a complex campaign against a pandemic like this. I don't want to put the West Midlands, I don't want to put anywhere into the measures that we have to do. But as you've heard from Chris, we have to, and as you've heard from me, we have to get that virus down. It is necessary. I mean, I'm afraid it is going up in the West Midlands, and as indeed it is across the whole country. There's no area where it isn't going up anymore. A alas, and that's why we've got to take especially dynamic measures in those areas that are particularly badly affected. And on your bigger point about what happens if there's no vaccine, well, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be the kind of scientific and technological progress that will start to make a real difference. Already, you're seeing how drugs are changing for the better, the mortality rates in ICU, drugs, the treatments, and understanding of the diseases.
We're getting to that point where, we're getting to the point where it just becomes waffle. It starts off as waffle, and then after about half an hour, there's only so much waffle you can take. But I mean, we know the facts of the matter, and actually, to be honest, we did before that press conference happened, because the measures were announced in Parliament. Though what you can hear is basically sort of the methods by which they are trying to present this as a collaborative process, but sort of also holding the barrel of a gun against local leaders, because they're sort of saying, we'd like to agree with local leaders that they'll have this particular lockdown in place, but if they don't, we'll have to impose it. Also, people want to protect their neighbours. It's sort of, there's some moral pressure, and then ultimately saying you're going to have to do what we say. All weekend, as we're going to discuss, local leaders, especially in the north of England, have been saying if you're going to impose these restrictions, which ultimately you only have to impose because you failed over the summer, then we want proper financial support to back it up. And Rishi Sunak, as you saw, didn't really have any answer as to why people are only getting paid 2/3 of their wage as opposed to 80% of their wages. And that's only if they fall actually into this very specific category, which is working in industries which legally have been forced to close. And obviously, if you go into a local lockdown, it's not only those industries which have legally been forced to close which are going to be damaged, but I mean all of them, right? Because people are going to be staying in their homes much more. Demand is going to be down. And I mean, even if you are, for example, if a cafe is open, it doesn't have to legally close, but they can only serve a much reduced number of people.
Can I ask also, what about their supply chains? If a bar shuts, that's not just the bar that's shutting, it's obviously the security staff that might work there, it's the cleaners, it's the people that sell them flowers every week, it's the supply chains. I mean, this is clearly not, it doesn't at least with a universal furlough scheme, those kinds of questions are redundant, whereas this highly tailored scheme doesn't seem very smart.
I've seen in the comments any further clarity on what these levels are, so I'm going to introduce, properly. You've just watched the Downing Street press conference. It was very waffly. We're going to explain what's actually been announced today and the implications of it, the politics of it all. As you already know, I'm joined by Aaron Bastani, and we're going to be talking for the next 45 minutes or so about the big changes today to the national lockdown, or it's called a three-tiered lockdown. Some people argue it shouldn't be called a lockdown. They're just new coronavirus restrictions. It won't look much like what the lockdown in March looked like unless we see significant changes. That's because schools are going to remain open, universities are going to remain open, and we're currently told all retail is going to remain open, even if you're in the top tier. So those tiers, I'll set them out to you. So you've got level 1, which is medium alert. So you start at medium because no one should be in a low risk, or no one should believe they're in a low risk area because there aren't any. The medium alert level consists of the current nationwide restrictions, including the rule of 6 and the 10 p.m. curfew. This will, at the moment, apply to most areas in the country, including London, actually. Sadiq Khan has suggested we might go up to level 2. Level 2, that's high alert, and that is currently going to apply to everywhere where a local lockdown is in place. And what that will mean is that indoor mixing between different households will be banned, but pubs and bars remain open. And then in a very high alert area, social mixing will be prohibited indoors and in private gardens. You can still go for a walk in a park, which is different from what was being briefed over the weekend and which I'm relieved about. In very high alert areas, in tier 3 areas, many businesses will be closed, including pubs, gyms and casinos. As it stands, there's only one region in tier 3, which is Merseyside, the Liverpool City region. But Boris Johnson is quite clear that he intends for many cities, regions to be also moved into tier 3 once he gets consent from the local authorities, because as he's just described there, he doesn't want to be seen to impose these from above, even though anyone who's had their eyes open for the last 6 months will know he has squandered so much political capital with local leaders, especially in the north, by sort of dictating the loosening of the lockdown from London in a manner which wasn't actually proportionate to the levels of coronavirus in those regions, and then against all good advice sort of running a really top-down version of test and trace, using outsourced companies, using Dido Harding instead of the local knowledge, which could have actually made it work and has done in Cumbria, which is interesting because we talked to John Ashton later, who was Public Health Director of the Northwest, based in Cumbria. He told me earlier a bit more about how those local systems work better. There was in that stream, as we showed you, there was a moment where Chris Whitty talked and we didn't have the slides, so we sort of went away from that stream. So what I want to do is introduce you to some slides which were shown earlier in the day in Jonathan Van Tam's press conference. And these are sort of the explaining the motivations for these restrictions, why new restrictions are necessary. So Jonathan Van Tam earlier spoke with a consultant from Manchester Hospital and Stephen Powis, the medical director of the NHS. And I just want to show you some of the most interesting slides from that. So this is about the geographical spread of coronavirus at the moment. So there you can see, this is a map we're going to get very used to seeing, I imagine. So you can see those on the left one, that's the number of weekly cases per 100,000 people. The darker regions is where you have more people coming down with coronavirus per week. And as you can see, it's very much concentrated in the northwest and the northeast and part of the Midlands. I think Nottingham at the moment has one of the highest levels of coronavirus in the country. So you can see there why these measures are being imposed more severely in the north. And then on the right-hand side, what you can see is the rate of change. And Jonathan Van Tam was very keen to sort of emphasize that whilst cases are currently most prevalent in the northwest and the northeast, the rate of change is quite fast across the country. So nowhere at the moment is, nowhere at the moment is particularly safe when it comes to coronavirus. You can see there that London and much of the southeast is in the darker brown color, which means that cases per week are increasing week on week, in terms of the previous week. So the rate of change there is high. I want to get up one more for you. This is a really important point. So this is to show how can we get this up? So this is graphic 5B, Fox. And this is about the age spread of who is catching it. And this is a heat map. So what you can see there is on the left-hand side, so on the y-axis, you've got people grouped into age groups. Obviously, you don't need me to tell you that they're the regions, and on the x-axis, you've got the dates. And what you can see there is that the epidemic this time around has been starting in the 16 to 29 age group. So, for example, if I'm looking at the northeast, you can see that the 16 to 29 age group there start having increased levels of coronavirus, so sort of 100 per 100,000 back at the start of September. That increases to over 500 per 100,000 by now. But then you can see it sort of also increasing through the age groups. And that matters, obviously, because older people are much more vulnerable to coronavirus. This is used by the government rightly to suggest that this epidemic can't just be kept to the young. If you let it run riot among younger people, it is also going to reach the elderly as well.
Also, I don't think we've got this data. It was available earlier. I think the number of hospitalisations amongst over 85s, not a huge group of society, it's gone up, I think, 40%.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which is obviously is a big number, given this is probably the early stages of a second wave.
Yep. And it does show you, I mean, there are lots of people, so the Julia Hartley-Brewers and the Carl Hennegans of the world, these are people who say, look, we need to just let this run wild among young people and protect the elderly. And the argument against them, which, to be fair to them, the government have been making, is to say, look, that's wishful thinking, because at the moment it's running riot among young people, and it is also spreading to the elderly, and no one has advocated let's not protect the elderly. So clearly there is a situation where our government, or maybe no government, is able to, when a virus is widespread in society, keep it from one particular section of society. I don't think anyone has managed that, so I don't think that's a government failure. I think that's why all governments around the world are trying to suppress the virus. Sweden was the only one who went for this sort of protect the elderly, and they had record deaths in care homes. So it's not a great example when it comes to that. I just want to show you two more, which again are hospitalizations. I don't have the plus 85 one you were talking about, but these two are fairly significant. So this is 5C, Fox, and this is the long-term trend in newly reported hospital cases. There, as you can see, we're not at the levels we were back in March and April, but the increase is actually fairly sharp in the northwest and the northeast. You can see there why why they're quite keen to put new restrictions there. And then the next one is probably the most dramatic, which is more granular. So it's showing you different hospital trusts. And you can see there that Liverpool University Hospital Trust in the blue is actually almost at its peak from earlier in the year. And that angle for me, the sort of rate of change there is scary. So you can see why they are having a stricter lockdown there. Although, to be honest, not that strict in a way. It is not much like the start of the year.
Well, it's not strict in so much as the only things which seem to be prohibited are having fun. If you're engaging in economic activity, if you're going to the office, if you're going to work, if you're going to school, if you're going to university, of course, we've got more than 1 million people right now in full-time student accommodation across the country. More than 1 million people moved in one weekend in September. Who thought that was a good idea? And the most amazing point of all is that had buy-in from both major political parties. It's no surprise then we're now in mid-October and we're here. And a major reason why, the principal reason why, is reopening schools, universities. Now, there's an argument to be made that had to happen. People need their education. I think putting people in their early 20s, late teens, into halls of residence was completely unnecessary, didn't have to happen, and it's a major contributing factor as to why we're about to have this massive second wave, and it's going to have huge consequences for the economy. I
mean, I want to push back slightly because I agree with you on universities. I don't really agree with you on schools because they have actually... Can we get that heat map back up, actually?
Well, I was to emphasise, I mean principally universities.
Yeah, because in schools, this is 5B. In schools, Jonathan Van Tam made quite the strong argument that basically under 15s aren't catching this that much, and they definitely don't seem to be a vector of it. So you can see there, it's that 16 to 29 age band, which is catching coronavirus, and then it's moving upwards to older age groups. So it actually does seem like we don't really need to stress out that much about people in the under 15 category. Cases aren't going up severely, and obviously the sort of social costs of closing schools are severe. So I personally, I think the Labour Party are right to support the opening of schools. I think we probably should all support the opening of schools. University is a completely different matter. Sixth form colleges, obviously, I mean, that's probably more open for debate, but it seems like people who are 15 and under, it's not that big a deal.
But I mean, okay, so what would be really interesting to know is also the breakdown of supply staff and teachers in schools age 16 to 29 who are getting it, because they might be a primary vector of transmission, right? Taking it out from schools. Again, like you said, it's a key difference here is that if you've got teenagers, you've got university students, they'll be mixing across various friendship circles, meeting new people all the time. Young kids don't do that. And to be clear about this, I don't think schools should be shut. And I don't think universities should necessarily be shut either. I just think this year, what should have happened was you have entirely remote learning. You only allow people who absolutely have to go into halls of residence. If you can study from home, that's what you do. And by the way, no tuition fees this year, because clearly entirely online teaching is nothing like the real deal. But something like that, and I don't think that's a particularly outlandish policy, would have required a bit of bravery and a bit of pushback against the vested interests in this country, the landlords, the developers, university managements. All they care about is money, this archipelago of interests around an industry, which is essentially, it's meant to be about educating people. Actually, for a lot of people, it's about making money. And that's why we had what we had in September, when more than 1 million people moved in one single weekend.
Yeah, I mean, the universities does seem completely indefensible, and there's so many graphs going around that do show that it is in student areas where you are seeing these huge spikes. I mean, coronavirus compared to non-student areas, it's phenomenal. It's quite clear that it's not just that the winter started all of a sudden, because that's a gradual process. The reason that coronavirus has exploded in the past couple of weeks is because students went back to universities. It's not their fault, but if you put young people from all over the country in the same place, they're obviously going to socialise a lot. They all live in halls together. It does become a bit of a biological weapon. I want us to talk about the sort of politics of the North-South divide in all of this. First of all, we've got, I think, 2,500 people watching this now. Let's get that up to 3,000. That means you need to give the show a share. We are also going to go... We've got a couple of tweets on the hashtag. So Christina Massey Stuckey. Great analysis again. It helps many people's sanity. Thanks, comrades. Oh, and that's with a super chat. Thank you very much. And a super chat from Baz Kames. Fabulous. Let's go to this North-South issue. So formalising a system of local lockdowns has opened up a new interesting dynamic between local leaders and the government in Westminster. It seems that after a tense weekend, the government has made some concessions, only minor ones. So in Liverpool, they were originally briefing that all hospitality would be closed, so restaurants and pubs. There was pushback from the local authorities there, and in the end, restaurants and I think pubs which mainly serve food, which includes Wetherspoons, apparently, are going to be able to stay open. The other sort of concession was that Manchester is not yet in the highest category, although it seems like Boris Johnson is going to be pushing for that to happen very soon. And negotiations between government and local leaders will be underway this week to try and get more local authorities into level 3. It is, I suppose, unsurprisingly, Andy Burnham, the Metro Mayor of Manchester, who has sort of really represented this pushback against the centralising impulse from the Conservative government in Westminster. So we're going to go to a few of his interventions this weekend. So it was last night, in fact, he shared a Telegraph headline saying, "Last orders for the North." So that was the headline on the Telegraph. And he says, "You can almost hear the glee in the Telegraph's voice in this headline, and also in the voice of a senior minister quoted as saying, 'We want them to own it.' By own it, I assume they mean the mess they created, but at least we're all clear about the strategy." So the point he's making there is very clear that these were plans drawn up in Westminster. They're necessary because of the measures over the summer, which were sort of designed with the levels of virus in the southeast in mind. He's pissed off. Another source, this is sort of evidence of that. This issue of the reason why you are seeing peaks or spikes in the north is because of policies in the south. This was sort of admitted by Jonathan Van Tam in his press conference earlier today, that the reason we're seeing these high levels in Manchester and elsewhere is because it never actually went that low. So I'm going to get up a tweet from Andy Burnham today. So he here is quote tweeting Robert Peston, who tweets, "Van Tam says problem in North stems from the failure to reduce disease levels there as much as in South. He reinforces argument of some local government leaders in North that initial lockdown was eased to suit conditions in London and South rather than in the North." You can see there, Andy Burnham, "I am grateful to the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for recognising this point. Too many rush to blame the public in the North without understanding this." And then he's shared some data there which is showing that cases never really reduced that much in Greater Manchester in the same way that they did in London, because their epidemic happened a little bit later than London's did. The biggest dispute is over what particular restrictions will be in place. We're going to talk a bit more in detail in a moment about the question of should pubs close? Is the curfew correct? Is it right that in those top tiers, all bars and pubs have to close? And finally, the issue of greater financial support. And Boris Johnson obviously tried to underplay it in the press conference we just saw, but there does seem to be some real gaps in what the government is currently promising. So we're going to show a video now. This is Andy Burnham. I think it was sort of a Zoom press conference that some of the northern mayors did over the weekend.
To accept the Chancellor's package as outlined yesterday would be to surrender our residents to hardship in the run-up to Christmas and our businesses to potential failure or collapse. And we are not prepared to do that. It would also run the risk of severe redundancies across the north of England, particularly when you combine the effect of any new local restrictions in this tier system with the end of the more general furlough scheme, which is still looming at the end of this month. And we estimate there are around 100,000 people in Greater Manchester still on the furlough scheme. If you combine the effect of all of those things, we think it would be to do long-term damage to the economy of Greater Manchester and the north of England.
That was Andy Burnham speaking about sort of the lack of economic support being offered to the north from Westminster, even though they're sort of imposing all of these restrictions. It's going to be a common theme over the next weeks and months. But we're going to go to our first interview of the evening. So earlier today, to find out more about this sort of dynamic that's going on between local leaders and Westminsters, I spoke to a perfect guest, actually, Professor John Ashton. So he was Director of Public Health for the North West of England and is author of Blinded by Corona, a manifesto for getting on top of the pandemic. So I started by asking John whether the local authorities in Liverpool, in Merseyside, were right to accept new measures.
I think absolutely that Greater Liverpool is correct to go with this, and in fact to ask for it. You know, we're in a very serious position at the moment. It's just like at the end of March, at the beginning of April, when the number of cases were doubling every few days, followed by the increase in hospital admissions and then the deaths. And what we know from that time, and this is all described in my new book, Blinded by Corona, is that we did too little too late. And then as a result of that, we finished up doing too much too late. You know, we locked down too late, we eased off too early, and now we're seeing this mess that we've got, and where people are very confused about what's going on. The whole of the north now, certainly the cities, are not dissimilar to Merseyside. And it's quite likely that other cities will have to follow suit in the near future. I mean, I think the fact that the political leaders have pushed back against some of this is mainly to do with the failure of the government to provide the adequate financial support to business. And we're being asked to see public health as being somehow in opposition to business, when actually they need to be hand in glove. You know, if the pandemic now accelerates the way it looks possible, then the economy is going to be stuffed. And we have to try and get on top of this. Part of the problem is that the very poor handling of this and the mixed messaging, the poor example by leading members of society, in particular Dominic Cumming, has meant that there's no trust with the government. And the young people in particular have been alienated by this. We've now seen the political leaders have been alienated. So it's becoming very anarchistic. You know, the government is unable to secure the loyalty and the following of the public and of the municipal leaders. This is a very dangerous position we're in. What needs to happen now is that the Prime Minister needs to put his hands up and admit that he's got it wrong, you know, hands up, listen to other people, broaden the circle of advisors. It's this narrow group of people drawn from the social circles in London and the academic circles that they all mix with. They need to give the money to the local authorities, public health teams, instead of stuffing the mouths of private companies with no track record of doing this kind of work, who failed abysmally. They need to put that resource into the local authorities, and they need to empower the local political leaders to make the decisions instead of constantly interfering. If we don't do that, I'm very fearful of what's coming down the tracks in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
It does seem to me like potentially the government has learnt from some of its errors, or at least it's sort of speaking as if it has. So people like you have been arguing for a long time that test and trace should be a local-based system, not one which is done on a national level with a big organisation like Serco. The government do seem to be saying they're going to commit some more money to local authorities. They're going to try and have more of a local system. I don't know if you feel like potentially the tide is turning.
So reluctant, this handover, you know, they're giving bits of it away. They're control freaks. I mean, they're like alcoholics who fall off the wagon. You know, they pretend to be doing it and then they don't do it. What they're doing is still keeping control of the tracking and tracing, or trying to. They will inform the local areas of complicated cases for testing and tracing. When they've come back and done that work, then they're mopping up the data back into the centre all the time. You know, this is the definition of a management consultant, is somebody who borrows your watch to tell you the time. What this government is doing is collecting everybody's data, hoovering up everybody's data, and then not giving it them back properly, or giving them it all back. They need to commit to giving it all back. What the government should be doing is saying to the local areas and the regions, how can we best help you? That's the question, not telling them what to do and then throwing them tidbits. That's the way they're behaving at the moment. This is serious, and it cannot be run by a group of largely men inside the M25. Be at home for a day or two a week, one parent or the other parent, if there are two parents, then this would provide the supervision for when the children are doing remote learning from home. We need to be employing the 30,000 plus teachers who graduated in June who haven't got jobs because the schools haven't been given the money to employ them, so we can have smaller class sizes. We need to put up temporary classrooms in the school playing fields and the yards so we can have smaller class sizes. 15 in a class instead of 30 plus. 15 as in a lot of the private schools as opposed to 30 plus in a lot of the state schools. Can the government please get its head around these challenges instead of just going ahead as if it doesn't matter what they do, and we'll just see what happens. Driving, looking in the rearview mirror all the time.
That was former Director of Public Health for North West, John Ashton, and author of Blinded by Corona, a manifesto for getting on top of the pandemic. Always a great speaker on these issues. Aaron, I want to go to you on this because I think over the weekend you sent me a WhatsApp saying you've been speaking to friends in the North and you think it's all going to start kicking off. And we had a little discussion about that. Where do you think this sort of political tension is going? What's the direction of travel here?
Well, kicking off is a strong word. What I would say is that right now, the explicit point of political tension against central government is coming from, to a lesser extent, Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, because she also has to administer a national response. If the SNP weren't in power in Holyrood, they'd probably be much more adversarial. Where you are seeing it is Northern mayors. So you're seeing it a little bit with Steve Rotherham. You're seeing it far more with Andy Burnham. And that seems to be, in embryo, a sort of point of political counterpower, an alternative political response to what you're seeing from Westminster. Now, taking Sadiq Khan as well. Obviously, to an extent, you can't really do that with any real authority because they don't really have much executive power. They don't have huge budgets. But it's perfectly possible that all of a sudden people like Burnham, people like Sadiq Khan start to outride Keir Starmer and the National Labour Party. And what I think for unionists and for sort of British nationalists, what they should be incredibly grateful for is the absence of any real movement for devolution in England, for the north of England, because you have Scottish nationalism, you have the SNP for decades. But what really makes that a national movement which can win is the global financial crisis 2008. Shortly thereafter, they form a national government at Holyrood, and of course, we've seen their rise ever since. They're now by far and away the most dominant party north of the border. It's perfectly plausible over the next 2-3 years, if we see this continued catastrophic economic and public health response, where it does seem to be a national policy almost of managed decline for much of the north. You know, we know that rates of COVID in some Tory seats are worse than various places which are presently facing shutdown. So there is inarguably a political dimension to this and a party political dimension to it. Had there been that antecedent voice saying, look, Westminster's let us down, we need more devolution, we need more political power in the north of England, in the Midlands, I think this would be the time where actually that has, rocket boosters underneath it, which is a lesson there actually for people, including on the left, that, you don't have to necessarily be winning things to make a difference, because before you know it, an opportunity comes along, like the global financial crisis. That's what made UKIP, that's what made the SNP. Plausibly, this crisis might be the making of a devolutionary movement for the north of England.
I mean, I think there's a lot to that. And it's also, in the same way that Nicola Sturgeon has sort of been able to use this to her advantage by saying, Scottish nationalism, the case for independence, isn't just, a romantic one. And it's not just an anti-Tory one either. It's also a pragmatic one, which is we're more competent than them. And also that sort of devolved government works better. Governments which are closer to the people work a little bit better. And I think you were going to have a massive case study that sort of, proves is a strong word, but a massive case study, which is an argument in that direction, which is the test and trace system we've had. Because we have had people in local government, people like Andy Burnham, to be fair to them, the front bench, even, they could have done it louder, but the Labour Party have been saying that test and trace should be in charge of local public health authorities, because they're the people who know the area. Great article in the Sunday Times, actually, about this, saying in Cumbria they have so much higher rates of contacts with people because they know the area. It's often people who are, known to authorities who are most hard to reach by a sort of national Serco-run system. Yeah. And they just have found that these local systems are way more effective. The government is starting to admit it, partly because they now are desperate to get the northern mayors on side and the northern local authorities on side, because they don't want to seem like they're imposing this. As Andy Burnham there tweeted, they want the northern leaders to have ownership of this so they can kind of blame them for it and the government don't have to take the flak. But they seem to have recognised that these local systems, which are closer to the ground, are much more effective than a national, top-down, Serco-run system. And it is the arrogance of people like Dominic Cummings who basically think, and I was thinking about this on the weekend, I was thinking, what's the relationship between the sort of theories of Dominic Cummings, which is that, you know, things work well when you put exceptional people in charge. Yeah. Most people are average, most people are incompetent. And he writes about the Manhattan Project, where it's all like, you used to have a system whereby the least effective person in the team would get almost voted out Big Brother style. So you'd only sort of have the elites rising to the top and doing technocratic government. And what that ignores is, I'm sure Dido Harding is fairly smart and qualified, but they've done this top-down system which is really disrespectful of anyone involved in it. You've got all of these outsourced people who have no background in public health. You've basically said to public health officials, oh, we don't believe you're particularly good at your job anyway. We're going to do this via a completely different top-down system. We're going to reinvent the wheel. Then it obviously all fails. Then they go crawling back to the public health officials, sort of saying, oh, can you actually help us out? No, now it's all failed. And just as sort of Nicola Sturgeon on coronavirus is an example for why an independent Scotland could work better. The fact that this local system has been proved to be much better than the national test and trace system, it is an argument for devolution, which I imagine people like Andy Burnham will start deploying. Let's talk about pubs. Before we do that, if you're new to this show, do please hit subscribe. We go live every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. And I mean, it coincided with our usual show this week. But often if we get one of these big political events, like a big announcement, we will go live unannounced, which is why you need to be subscribed and have notifications on so you never miss a live show. Our next story. Oh, and also we've got Vanta Black with a £10 super chat. Thank you so much. We always appreciate those. The war over pub closures. So there was a concession to the hospitality industry in the measures announced today as compared to the restrictions we were expecting. It had been briefed that restaurants and pubs would be closed in tier 3 areas. Now it's only pubs and bars which are going to be closed, unless they are predominantly food pubs. Again, I've already said this is going to be, there's going to be a fight over what counts as a food pub and what doesn't. But this is unlikely to end concern from the industry. Bars and pubs, they are still arguing there isn't the evidence base for you to be hitting us in this way. We've just made ourselves COVID secure. As you'll find out, I don't think that means very much, but I'm sympathetic to them because they were told it existed. They are saying we are being unnecessarily hit hard. This is playing as well into that sort of local, national dynamic, especially with respect to Manchester again. So Burnham's nighttime economy advisor is heading up a legal challenge against the government on the proposed closure of pubs and bars if Manchester goes into tier 3, which we can assume will happen quite soon. I think we can go to a quote from Sacha Lord. So he founded Manchester's Warehouse Project and is nighttime economy advisor to Metro Mayor Andy Burnham. He told The Guardian, this is graphic 9B, if we can get that up, Fox. So he said, we are calling out for the scientific evidence that supports closure. The vast majority of businesses have put in place impeccable measures to protect their customers, all at an extra cost to their business. Yet it feels like the government are taking another cheap shot at the hospitality industry. Some decent points there. He just wants evidence. Someone who didn't manage to put up or didn't manage to produce that evidence. And can we get video 7 ready, Fox? This is a very painful clip this morning from Sky. So Oliver Dowden, who is responsible for the bar and pub industry as culture minister, he was asked, what is the evidence for these restrictions on pubs and bars? And yeah, as I say, he struggled to come up with the goods.
Well, there is other evidence, for example, in the United States that shows that there is quite a high risk associated with hospitality settings. But
tell me about it. Because you're going to get sued. Apparently, business leaders in the north have said, you know what, we've had enough. and they're mounting a legal challenge to the government's lockdown restrictions, particularly about hospitality. So tell me what these rules are in the United States.
So there's also academic evidence from the United States, but I think they will find that if they challenge the government, we do have a robust evidence base for doing so.
So tell me what this evidence is.
Well, the evidence shows that there is a higher risk of transmission in hospitality settings.
And whose evidence is that?
There's academic evidence from the United States.
Be more precise.
Which, I mean, I'm happy to share the greater details with you. I don't have the greater details to hand now, but there is academic evidence for the United States. No, we have academic evidence from the United States. I'm afraid I don't have the name of the study to hand.
And that was a very weak interview. There is evidence. I've got no idea what it is. I mean, if you are a minister and you're doing the media round, you get told in advance that you're doing the media round. It wasn't that he went on to do an interview about something else and this was sprung on him. He was the government minister who was explaining and defending government policy today. And he had no idea what he was talking about. I mean, he could have actually made a stronger argument. So there is some evidence that restaurants and bars are one vector of coronavirus. The CDC. So I'm going to get up what I think is the study he was referring to, but he didn't have any background knowledge about it. So can we get up graphic 11, Fox? So the US Centre for Disease Control found that people who tested positive for coronavirus were twice as likely to have eaten in a restaurant in the prior 2 weeks than people who tested negative. Now, when I first read this, I thought, well, that's probably just because they are more social people. You are more likely to get coronavirus if you hang out with people. So this is not necessarily a causal relation, but from that article, the NPR write-up of the study, get up a couple of quotes which I found more convincing. So this is 11B, Fox. So the study found that both positive and negative cases reported going to gyms, hair salons, shops, and in-home group gatherings at about the same rate. But the positive cases were about twice as likely to report dining out at restaurants within the 14-day period before feeling sick. It goes on, this is a quote from the researchers. Masks cannot be effectively worn while eating and drinking, whereas shopping and numerous other indoor activities do not preclude mask use. The study also points out that many reported cases tied to restaurants have been linked to air circulation. Direction, ventilation, and intensity of airflow might affect virus transmission, even if social distancing measures and mask use are implemented according to current guidance, the CDC note. So to me, that does seem like a fairly decent evidence base. I mean, all of the studies that we're looking into about coronavirus at this point in time are fairly preliminary.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, although I'm going to go to Jonathan Van Tam, but respond to that and then we'll go to...
I mean, have you gone to a sandwich bar or a cafe in the last 2 weeks?
I've been to a restaurant which sold booze and it seemed to me like a super spreader.
Have you been to like a Pret-a-Manger or a Cafe Nero or a Starbucks in the last 2 weeks?
No.
I'd be very interested to know how they're categorising it. Somewhere where somebody sits down and eats, because a huge percentage of the population has done that in the last 2 weeks, and you wouldn't necessarily think of it as a restaurant. There's a graphic which was shared earlier on today by Gary Neville from Tory Fib citing government data, which doesn't really disagree. Most of the cases are coming from workplaces, care homes, and education.
We'll show me that. Let's get that up while we're showing this next clip. So this next clip is Jonathan Van Tam, who is sort of explaining what I found quite convincing as to why it is that transmission in pubs and restaurants can't really be mitigated against that much.
We do know that this virus, unfortunately, thrives on the thing we like most, which is human contact. And the aerobiological conditions that favour the spread of the virus are well encapsulated by the Japanese advice about the 3 Cs. The first C is closed spaces, by that often with poor ventilation. The second C is crowded spaces. And the third C is close contact. And to that, I would add my own emphasis on D, the duration with which you're likely to be in those spaces. And finally, V, volume, the level of noise, because we do know, and we have increasingly strong evidence about shouting and singing as pressure points on the virus in terms of making the expulsion of virus-laden particles go further and the transmission therefore to become more intense. So all of those settings where the 3 Cs and duration and volume may apply are areas where the virus will thrive and spread if we allow it to.
So that was Jonathan Van Tam sort of explaining. I mean, he was using the Japanese, their phrase, theirs is not hands, face, space. Is that ours one? Hands, face, space?
That's it, isn't it?
Is there only three? I feel like there was a fourth. Maybe it is just hands, face, space. Theirs is, oh God, it's the three C's. But we were just talking about this Tory Fibs graphic, so I wasn't actually quite listening there. The three C's, what is it? Closed space, close contact, and crowded. Closed space, close contact, crowded, I think. You just watched it. To which he added loud voices, and you've been there for a while. And to me, that's fairly convincing as to why, especially pubs, because pubs are, even if you've got the music on low, you've still got lots of people there. It's difficult to speak particularly quietly, and it is when you're expelling all of that air that you are at risk of spreading it. Can we get up this Tory Fibs graphic? No, we can't get it up. Anyway, what that's showing, Gary Neville retweeted it, is that multiple COVID-19 outbreaks for the last 4 weeks, according to the PHE, have mainly happened in education, the workplace and care homes, and not that many from hospitality. I mean, there's obviously a valid epidemiological debate here. I'd kind of argue that you wouldn't necessarily know where people have caught it from other than in an institutional setting. It's only in sort of the university or the workplace or a care home where it's quite easy to tell that everyone has caught it in the same place.
I mean, I just feel like I say, I think we clearly have to have big safeguard measures in place. But it does feel quite dramatic to say that 1 million people are going to move in a single weekend. And I'm using this example repeatedly to make the point because it's the most absurd one. I appreciate that. 1 million people can move in a single weekend to appease the interests of landlords and people who basically make a great deal of money out of students. But we're going to and look, this is not about I want to keep pubs open so I can have a drink. It's about what's the most effective solution here. And it's pretty obvious from the data that we're appealing to right now that education and the workplace are they're the primary vectors in regards to what we're seeing.
Not schools, though.
Not schools.
Universities.
Universities. And, yes, we don't want people to be going out 3 nights a week getting pissed up, but could somebody be able to maybe go to a quite Spartanly populated pub once a fortnight? I mean, I think that's plausible. I think that's reasonable. And actually, that's how most people are behaving right now, right? I just feel like, again, it's not because I want the pubs and restaurants to stay open. I just think that is obstructing us from having a much more meaningful conversation about work. People are going to open plan offices. But nobody is talking about open plan. Everything was saying all these things which are so terrible about restaurants and pubs. Guess what? That's most offices in this country. Why aren't we having a conversation about that? Why aren't we saying let's have a government scheme to change the layout of open plan offices to actually give people individual cubicles and so on and so forth? That's not part of the debate because right now the focus is on activity which isn't economically productive, i.e. if you're having fun, let's stop you doing it.
Yeah, I suppose the only pushback I'd do there is that, pubs are an important sector of the economy. So there are people who are making the economic argument, which is that you have to keep these things open. So it's not just that issue where they say you're allowed to do it if there's a till, because obviously there is a till in bars and restaurants, and they're still saying this is too high a risk.
They're not a principal part of the economy. The government wants us to keep on shopping, and they want offices to stay open, and they want schools to stay open, because as we can see from the GDP statistics, basically, 80% of the economy takes over. I mean, that's just,
I mean, I disagree. I think the argument as to why retail and education, or at least primary and secondary education, is safer than pubs and bars, that to me seems intuitive. I agree with you that obviously the biggest vector for this new outbreak we've had is kids going back to university. We both think that was stupid. But I mean, we could debate the curfew for ages. Let's look actually at something that went viral this weekend that was particularly to do with that 10 p.m. curfew, which was people playing cricket on at 10 p.m. on Saturday. Can we get up some footage of this? And so the argument here was that this is made possible because of that 10 p.m. curfew, the idea that people here are sort of spread out. Again, this to me is a little bit misleading because, these are scenes where people are crowding together, but it is outside. So to be honest, I think if they're outside a pub as opposed to inside it, they're safer anyway, right? I mean, maybe they are going to get pissed and go to a house party.
Did you see the pictures as well from, I think it was Leicester Square or Piccadilly Circus?
No, I didn't see that.
And it's like 50 people. And you go, you know what? That's really good going. Piccadilly Circus on a weekend, 50 people. Come on, outside.
That's fine. Andy McDowell in the comments said, the problem is why just hospitality? We had no problem in Liverpool until the universities opened and 90,000 students descended on our city. And hey, guess what? Now we have a huge wave of new infections. I do take that point.
Exactly.
And I do think that the government haven't really been upfront about this. because, it is harder to reverse this. Once the students are there, there's nothing you can do. So that was a huge error, and the government haven't put up their hands and say, look, we're really sorry we did this, but it's hard to reverse the decision, so we are going to make it up financially to the people who are going to have to take the flak now, which is the hospitality sector. That's not what they've said, and I think people in the hospitality sector are quite right to feel like they have been disproportionately blamed in the public eye, even though I think it could still be reasonable to ask them to close, or at least to not be open to the extent they were before. Our final story for the evening. One group who have felt left out of coronavirus support packages and altogether disrespected since the crisis began are people working in the arts. So this disrespect was I'm going to start that whole section again, because I already ate my words there. One group who have felt left out of the coronavirus support packages and altogether disrespected since the crisis began are people working in the arts. This disrespect was reflected in a new advert which appeared online this weekend. So we can get this up. Fatima's next job could be in cyber. She just doesn't know it yet. And you can see there, if you're listening to the podcast, a ballerina. God, I'm really struggling with finishing words at the moment. A ballerina. And this is suggesting that she could quit that job. Well, presumably she's lost that job in the coronavirus crisis, and now she can train in cyber, which I'm not sure if that is a job. Coding, I suppose.
Cyber security. That's what I thought it meant.
Oh, is it cyber security? Is that what cyber means?
Look, if you're a 65-year-old sort of boomer, but that's who they're look. It doesn't mean it's the wrong word, but the point is they're trying to appeal to the people who would use the wrong word. Is it genius or are they really stupid? Well, given they keep on winning, it's probably the former.
Anyway, Oliver Dowden, so the culture secretary, has since disowned this ad. You didn't see it in that particular image, but it has the HM government. It's an advert that's government branded, so it's an official one. Oliver Dowden, after Twitter got really angry about this, and lots of ballerinas, dancers, people in the arts who feel like you're just saying, well, you've lost your job now, so retrain as something else, even if you spent 7 years training for it, even if it's your passion. They've just said, oh, fuck it, there's a pandemic. No one's ever going to go to the theatre again, are they? Very strange inference there anyway. The idea that a job that there isn't much demand for during a pandemic is also going to be unviable in a year's time just seems completely bizarre to me. I don't know how they've got there. But Oliver Dowden, anyway, he disowned the ad. So let's get up his tweet from the afternoon. So he writes, to those tweeting #hashtag Fatima, this is not something from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and I agree it was crass. This was a partner campaign encouraging people from all walks of life to think about a career in cybersecurity. I want to save jobs in the arts, which is why we are investing £1.57 billion. Now, there's some problems with this, which is if it has the HM government branding on it, you can't say, oh, it's not my responsibility because we outsourced responsibility for that. It's like the government can't say, Boris Johnson can't stand up and say, sorry, the test and trace system didn't work. It was actually not run by us, it was run by Serco. Because the reason it's run by Serco is because he hired Serco to do it. So the government can't say, oh, look, this advert's got no responsibility for us. It's not our responsibility, even though it has our branding on it, because we paid some consultants to do it. Because whatever the consultants produce is yours. You asked them to do it. You commissioned it. And I assume that someone in the department also signs it off. And again, what we're seeing, if you watched the show we did on Friday, where there was the interview with Rishi Sunak, where he was asked, if you work in the arts, are you saying they should retrain in a different industry? And he was sort of in response saying, well, I'm not saying artists should necessarily retrain. I'm just saying people who are struggling with work should retrain. And I feel the same thing here is going on with Oliver Dowden, whereby they're saying, no, we haven't specifically said dancers should get different jobs. But push comes to shove, ultimately they are. And they are saying, which again, I think is completely irrational. They're saying, if you don't have a job over the next 6 months during a global pandemic, then you should retrain. Because retraining to be a coder, by the time you've retrained to be a coder, theatres will have reopened.
It's a bit like Spitting Image. It was commissioned because Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. And then, of course, he's no longer leader of the Labour Party. And you have this terrible series which really has no raison d'etre. But it also,
and then Matt Ford's just like, well, I can't take the piss of the Labour leader because I quite like Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
So he's just, I don't think he even has a character.
But it doesn't really do much. But I was going to say also, it's an interesting sort of inversion. Jeremy Corbyn at Glastonbury in 2017 saying, everybody has a poet inside of them. And basically, the government is now saying, every ballerina has a a surveillance expert inside of them. I mean, it does feel like some bizarre reiteration of the sort of Stasi Germany without the excellent childcare and universal housing policy.
Yeah, I mean, it is also, I mean, to be cynical about this, what it looks like, because I can't really see the economic rationale for saying, if you have trained in the arts, which is clearly going to be severely damaged during the coronavirus crisis, you should retrain as a coder. Because, as I say, by the time you've trained as a coder, the pandemic will be over. Maybe there'll be a glut of coders, and the ballet schools will be reopened, and there'll be lots of people who want ballet lessons, because people are going to want to, live for joy after this pandemic. Everyone's going to realize, live for the moment. Let's learn to dance. Maybe there'll be a boom in dancers.
Well, that's what happened in the 20s after the great influenza, right?
Yeah, that's the point. They didn't call it the Roaring Twenties. It was roaring because everyone wanted to go out and have a good time after the misery of the pandemic, right?
And the First World War, obviously.
So what this and the First World War, yeah,
just to be
that was a big deal. Well, more people died from the Great Influenza. Not in Western Europe. I think most people died from the Great Influenza in India. But what point were we making?
Dancers will still be needed.
The reason, this doesn't make economic sense, but the reason they are sort of telling dancers to get new jobs is because Rishi Sunak wants to make a point to his backbenchers that this is not socialism we're running in this country. We are telling people to use their individual responsibility and go out and pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And also he's desperate to save just the odd pound here and there to try and give off the impression of fiscal responsibility. Even though they quite rightly have dumped this idea of balanced books. Rhetorically, they haven't, but in terms of practice, they have, because we're going to be in the biggest debt we've been since wartime, quite rightly, again. But they are sort of taking it out on people, to maintain the pretense of sort of like a free market logic. They're doing these completely irrational policies which are directed at people they know will never vote for the Conservatives.
Well, okay, so the first question, who's paying for the training? If it's central government, like you said, I mean, it's quite obvious that's just going to be a complete waste of time and money. If you're going to train somebody who's presently a ballerina to become a doctor, that's going to be £250,000. By the way, we should do that for many people. We need many more doctors. But like I say, that's a huge amount of sunk money. Now, because they're Tories, they'll say, no, these individuals should be doing it. But again, that's not an optimal allocation of resources, because you'd say, well, look, they've taken out £20,000, £30,000 debt to retrain for a job they're not actually going to have, because ultimately there'll be a return of ballet at some point in the future. That money could have been spent consuming goods and services, putting it back in the economy. It could have been spent on starting a business or buying a home. Far more productive economic activity could have been a result of it. So, like you say, right, left, James O'Brien, John McDonnell, this doesn't make any sense. Maybe it does for James O'Brien, because he kisses Rishi Sunak's ass.
Yeah, he does. Apparently he said he played a blinder today. We're going to get up on a separate topic. A tweet from Sienna Rogers from Labour List. This is Labour Party news. So news from Starmer on the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill. He tells PLP that if Labour amendment falls, he does not believe they should vote the bill down. So this was the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill. We spoke about this sort of at length in a previous show. I think it was last week. I lose track of time sometimes. But anyway, the reason the bill is controversial is because it makes law breaking by covert agents legal, which is fine in some circumstances. Obviously, if you want to be an undercover agent, you're sometimes going to have to break the law so that you don't ruin your cover, as it were. If you're trying to infiltrate a terrorist cell, then sometimes you're going to have to take part in the planning of terrorist attacks so later you can foil them. But the problem with the legislation is it didn't impose any limits on what kind of laws you can break. So unlike, for example, the USA, it doesn't rule out murder, it doesn't rule out sexual abuse, it doesn't rule out torture, in fact. So the risk, the worry is that it gives carte blanche to security agencies to basically tell their agents they can do whatever they want. Also, not just security agencies, also the Food Standards Agency. They can do whatever they want with no fear of prosecution. Now, the Labour Party's position, it seemed at the time, was to say that we're going to abstain on this because we agree in principle that we do need some sort of law which brings law breaking by agents above board and regulates it. But we're going to abstain because in the next section, what we want to do, not the next, the next reading, what we want to do is amend it so that we have limits for things like murder and torture. And what Keir Starmer is here saying, it seems like a bit of a U-turn. He's saying that even if we don't manage to amend it, even if we don't manage to rule out murder and torture from this bill, we'll just let it go through anyway. It does seem you know, I tried to make sense last week when we were discussing this of the position that you amend on the second reading. No, sorry, you abstain on the second reading to amend later. But if you're going to let it through, even if your amendments fail, then I mean that argument just collapses.
Keir Starmer's entire strategy is about winning over potential Labour voters amongst the Tories in marginals, particularly in the seats they lost in 2019. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable electoral strategy, but it rests on the presumption that all the other people that voted for you, many of them holding quite socially liberal values, and by the way, this isn't socially liberal to say that, you know, we shouldn't give carte blanche to the security services to kill or potentially torture people in our name. You'd imagine it's the bare, you know, the sort of the bare necessities of how liberal democracy should function. Apparently not. And the question is, there's a trade-off here. You're trying to appeal to those voters, but how many of your present sort of electoral constituency are you going to lose? And this is the story of Labour over the last 20 years. It keeps on taking its voters for granted. So we need to get these people. If we can't get these people, we don't win. And then they win those people. Sort of right now, they've got lots of affluent, socially liberal people in cities. They've got graduates. They've got young people. They've got ethnic minorities. They've got much of the sort of urban sort of working class. And now they're taking those for granted, just the way they took red wall voters for granted for 25 years, you know, really all the way through to 2019, realistically. But even if you're a Jeremy Corbyn supporter, all the way through to 2015. So, yes, it makes sense. I don't think it's going to work because you can't just take your entire 10 million electoral constituency from the last time round for granted. It won't happen. And this is a huge, huge deal. You know, this is a clear return to the sort of authoritarian politics of New Labour. And yes, New Labour, they won. They won 3 elections. But this is going back to New Labour after 2005 when they stopped winning and they were unpopular and they were deeply authoritarian.
The ID cards here.
The ID cards, Alan Johnson. Well, look, Alan Johnson was part of a government which became increasingly unpopular, the tail end of New Labour and Tony Blair. So I don't think right now Labour come across as principled, as likeable, as interesting, as offering an alternative, or even as particularly competent. You know, right now we're seeing lots of people on the front bench, I won't name names, and they're on the television, on radio, they're deeply unimpressive, deeply unimpressive individuals. And there are far more impressive people right now on the back benches. One of them is Rebecca Long-Bailey. You could say she should have been removed from the shadow cabinet. But the point is, there are serious, talented people in the Labour Party, not as many as there should be, who are being demoted. Nadia Whittome is one, Rebecca Long-Bailey is another, Zahra Sultan is another who wasn't put there in the first place. Meanwhile, you've got people who are very underwhelming gracing our TV screens. And I think you put it all together, I get Starmer, what he did. Politicians will always take opportunities. That's what politicians do. But I feel particularly sorry for people who were left-wing and thought Keir Starmer was going to be a champion of human rights and democracy abroad, because right now, from what we're seeing, that is not his priority whatsoever.
I mean, in terms of that, what do Labour appear? I mean, Labour appear, the polls say, well, people think Keir Starmer is competent.
Well, so, this week, they've gone down, his personal approval ratings. He's negative for the first time in, I think it was Ipsos Mori.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
And anyway, I'd say the problem here is more the principle than that it's going to backfire electorally, because, to be honest, I don't think that many people are following the likes of this bill. But, I mean, I do think it is fairly morally abject. Anyway.
Well, I just want to be quickly, you know, YouGov and Ipsos Mori this week, and we shouldn't be talking about polls 4 years out from a general election, but in terms of his personal favourability, he was negative for the first time. And I think that's because it's not even actually necessarily on the content of this law, Michael, I agree with you, right? I think people get a sense, wow, this guy's abstaining on everything, right? What does he stand for? He's very slippery, you know, doesn't seem to be anything to this guy. At the very moment, we need real solutions. And I think he's going to have to, at some point, recognise there's a window of opportunity, what defines me, what defines my politics, and he's going to have to take it. If he doesn't, it'll pass him by.
Survation today have him on +5 net ratings and Johnson on -14. So in terms of his popularity, I don't think his people
it's down and he's on +5.
I don't think his people will be particularly upset about
Michael, he's +5 and he's going down and he's -1 with Ipsos Mori. Come on. No, but seriously, he's 6 months into his leadership and he's had kid gloves with the media and he's -1 with Ipsos Mori. I don't think that... It's not bad, but I don't think it's particularly good. And 60,000 people have died.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't be bothered to debate Starmer's personal ratings. We'll get a psephologist on.
No, and look, it's all broadly irrelevant 4 years out from a general election. But, you know, I do think there's a point to be made here, which is personally, I don't think it plays to his advantage. People are entitled to disagree, of course.
We're going to finish on some super chats. Naomi Begg with a £5. Great show, guys, as always. Michael, can I get a happy birthday for tomorrow? I'm turning 30 in lockdown and not looking forward to it. Happy birthday, Naomi. Are you in? I presume you're then in a local lockdown kind of area. You can maybe go for a walk with your friends, even if you're in Merseyside, but not much else. So enjoy that. Make the most of it. Alan Kennedy with a £5. Is this something we as millennials and future generations are going to have to live with every pandemic? Read the new Learn to Code. Well, I think by the next time we have a pandemic, they're going to have a whole generation of people who started learning to code during the first time, and we're going to have all these horror stories. You know, I learned to do something that I thought was going to be useful during the pandemic, and then there was all this demand for ballerinas, but my muscles had already frozen up by then. Real horror tragedy stories. And Asiat P with 20. Lots of love. A nice, simple message there. And we do appreciate the donation. We are going to wrap it up there for tonight. That was a bit of an experimental show. We don't normally do a stream for a Downing Street briefing. So let us know on Twitter in the comments if you enjoyed that. If you prefer us to just show the stream and do the instant reaction afterwards. If you wanted us to talk more over it, less over it, we want to know. You know, we do this for you. So do let us know on the hashtag Tysky Sour or in the comments underneath this show. As ever, we can only do this kind of thing because you guys support us financially. If you are already a supporter of Novara Media, thank you so much. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support. I'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. for the next edition of Tysky Sour. Aaron, I think our audience can check out the Bastani Factor tomorrow at 7 p.m.
I believe so. We're going to be talking to Grace Blakely about her new book. I might be joining you on Wednesday as well. I don't know what's going on there, but
you are going to be on Wednesday.
I'm happy to.
Aaron's going to be back on Wednesday.
Can I just say as well? It was. I thought today was, given it was an hour and 45. I thought it was the technically best show.
Well done, Fox.
By Michael and Fox. 2 great interviews, and as Michael said, only possible because of our contributors. And if this crisis has a second wave, we're going to need far more of this. We're in a much better place than we were a year ago, thanks to your support. So thank you very much.
What's your favourite emoji, Fox? The Fox emoji. Can we get some Fox emojis in the comments, please? That's it for us. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.